Back on March 31st, we talked about the absurdity of the proposition of most EVM-style DEXs. I give you my money, and then I'm the one who takes the L. I'm the party subjected to the impermanent loss risk, and my only hope is to maybe make it up via yield farming. We also talked about the goal of the next crop of Cardano DEXs to fix this. Now let's discuss what this will mean when the rest of the crypto space figures out what Cardano's about to do. Ready? Let's go. We are going to discuss 3 excellent recent threads on the potential upcoming death of impermanent loss via the Cardano EUTXO Grim Reaper, a development in open source governance in Cardano, and some news out of another upcoming DEX. If you hate the idea of impermanent loss as much as I do, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. I'm glad to report that for the last 2 epochs, we have once again outperformed the statistical expectation. We minted more blocks for the last 2 epochs than they expected. You probably remember that back on March 31st, in this video, we talked about the lameness of impermanent loss in automated market maker DEXs, like are often found in the EVM Ethereum account balance world. If you don't remember what impermanent loss is, impermanent loss happens to you when you're a liquidity provider in one of these AMM DEXs, and the prices of the 2 assets in the trading pair diverge. You suffer impermanent loss. It's the scourge of the AMM DEX LP world. And the only way for liquidity providers in those DEXs to sort of make up that loss when it occurs is if there is some kind of yield farming attached to that liquidity pool. And that's the reason why yield farming exists in AMM DEXs. We also talked about the goal of the next crop of Cardano DEXs like Maladex and Genius Yield to eliminate impermanent loss. Recently, there have been 3 big threads around these same issues from this poster, Suraj. According to this, he's a blockchain gaming enthusiast and a medical resident. And I think he lays out a very convincing case that Cardano might be just about to revolutionize DeFi. In his first thread, Suraj gives us a really good, straightforward, layman's terms explanation of the difference between an AMM DEX and an order book DEX, which is something we've covered many times in this channel, so we won't jump into that now. But then he goes ahead and gives us an explanation of how the capital inefficiency of AMM DEXs leads to the impermanent loss that is the bane of DeFi participants in EVM systems. Then he goes on to explain why AMMs are the default choice in the EVM world. And it's basically because when you have this notion of shared mutable global state, the whole global state problem we talk about so much on this channel with EVM blockchains, it's very problematic to create an order book style DEX because one party's modifications might prevent other parties' actions on the blockchain from working correctly. We've covered this kind of thing before. The huge advantages of local state, as in Cardano, versus global state in the EVM world. What I love about this thread is that Suraj lays out the harsh, naked truth. He says, AMM is not a real innovation. And by this, my interpretation is that it's not really a step forward. It's not a big improvement. In his words, it is an inferior model that could be easily implemented and replicated on EVM. It's a workaround. AMMs exist because they were a workaround because order book DEXs were problematic in an EVM environment. In his next thread, Suraj addresses an obvious question. They've got an army of developers over in the EVM world, and they're constantly trying to improve their products. What about Uniswap v3? Wasn't it supposed to help reduce impermanent loss? Uniswap v3 introduced concentrated liquidity, where liquidity providers could allocate capital at specific price ranges called range orders, and fees for providing liquidity would be collected only at this price range. When an asset price exited the bound of a range order, no liquidity would be provided and no fees are collected. Sounds like a good solution to impermanent loss, right? The problem with impermanent loss is that the price of the assets is outside the range you really want it to be as an LP. So if you can just provide a range for your provision of liquidity, that should solve the problem, right? Unfortunately for the EVM crowd, this report from back in November from Topaz Blue and Bancor points out that that is not quite the case. They looked at 17 different liquidity pools in Uniswap v3 that made up 43% of the total value locked in Uniswap v3. And they found that the liquidity providers, even under this Uniswap v3 system of ranged orders, would have been better off hodling. In fact, that the LPs suffered 260.1 million in impermanent loss, and they would have been better off by 60.8 million if they had just hodled their assets instead of being liquidity providers in those pools. The only group that did okay were the Flash LPs who provide liquidity in a single block. That works kind of like a flash loan. They were the only ones who actually did okay. It didn't really matter if you were, other than the Flash LPs, it didn't really matter if you held your liquidity position for a long time or a shorter time. As they put it, all time segments lost. So unfortunately, the recent best efforts of the army of developers over in the EVM world have not been able to remedy the ills of impermanent loss in AMM DEXs. But Suraj offers that the concentrated liquidity solutions being built in the next generation Cardano DEXs like Cardano Maladex and Genius Yield, Maladex and Genius Yield, might just be the answer. In the third of these threads, Suraj points out that these efforts by Maladex and Genius Shield can actually work because Cardano is an EUTXO ledger architecture, not account balance like the EVM world. Again, this relates to the shared mutable state in an account balance EVM type system versus the local state of an EUTXO system. This shared global state in the EVM world leads to things like a lot of failed transactions with heavy transaction fees for failed transactions because fees can't be deterministic in this account balance EVM world. And also the much bigger surface area for attacks that leads to this phenomenon that we've called the robbery forest over in the EVM world. But when you think about it, it also has a really big impact on this whole notion of a DEX. If two or more parties can change the same data, and if their lifetimes overlap, then there's a risk of one party's modifications preventing other parties from working correctly, other parties' activities from working correctly, whatever they're trying to do. So if you think about it, if any of a bunch of different parties can all change the same data, it's very problematic to have something that looks like a limit order in this EVM account balance world. Whereas with local state, you can have things that look like limit orders. So you can create a model for a DEX that doesn't involve this lack of ability to predict beforehand what the price is going to be because so many different parties can change the same data. It's mutable, shared global state. A whole bunch of different parties can change the same data. So until your transaction actually executes in the EVM accounts balance world, you don't really know what the actual price in that liquidity pool is going to be. Whereas if you have local state, you can have this notion of a limit order. You can put an order out there to sell X number of tokens of any particular asset at X price, and it can sort of exist independently of the rest of the global state. Somebody can come and pick up that order. That's the order book phenomenon that's possible in an EUTXO architecture that's not really possible in the EVM model. Of course, this hidden superpower of our Cardano EUTXO blockchain is exactly why our first DEX was an order book DEX and not an AMM. The guys over at MuesliSwap were super smart and probably thought to themselves, why build an AMM DEX, which is going to have this gigantic impermanent loss problem, when we can just build an order book DEX that won't have this problem whatsoever? Everybody will be able to exchange assets peer to peer, and nobody's going to have to deal with this impermanent loss. Of course, the big problem is people also want to make money by providing liquidity to these DEXs. You can go ahead and provide liquidity all day to an order book DEX like the MuesliSwap DEX, but you don't have that same LP role that you can actually get paid for like you do in an AMM. That's what everybody's hoping for in this next generation of Cardano DEXs, examples being Maladex and Genius Shield. They're hoping that we can have this same order book type DEX where there's no impermanent loss, but you can still have this LP role where you actually get paid for providing liquidity. If the Cardano ecosystem can pull this off, it'll be a huge game changer. Who would want to be a liquidity provider in a DEX where they have to suffer the great uncertainty of impermanent loss when they could be an LP in a DEX where there is no impermanent loss? But there is probably a caveat here. As we all know, markets set prices, and the market has yet to tell us how much we actually get paid as an LP if we're not assuming the risk of impermanent loss. After all, I think we can assume that part of what we're getting paid for is that assumption of risk. Maybe we can look to liquidity provision in liquidity pools where both assets in the pair are stable coins, where there won't be as much deviation in price as some kind of indicator of the discount in remuneration we might be looking at when there is no impermanent loss. We still haven't even talked about another huge strength of Cardano that Suraj points out right here, and that's that with Cardano, beyond just the EUTXO architecture, you can also have on-chain validation and off-chain computation. This is something that I think we learned from Ethereum. That's that a blockchain makes a terrible world computer. But if you do your computation off-chain, things get a lot easier. This is a whole topic of its own, and we'll jump into this another day. In other news, it looks like the Cardano ecosystem is moving forward on governance at a great pace. Here's Liquid Labs announcing, happy to announce, Agora governance module is now open source for Cardano Plutus developers to access on-chain DAO tooling. Huge thanks to the talented engineers at MLabs, ADAO community, and LiquidX who built these contracts. This is going to get very, very interesting. Right now, we're witnessing the very first generation of big Cardano projects, and this is a great trend. They're open sourcing the stuff that they know will be valuable for Cardano going forward, including the governance DAO stuff. This is a really good trend. I hope this continues. I don't know if we'll be so lucky to see this kind of development being open sourced forever. Projects going forward, other projects that come later, subsequent projects. I don't know if we'll be so lucky to see them open sourcing so much of what they do, but right now I think the whole ecosystem is going to benefit from this trend. Finally, here's some news that's near and dear to my heart. I like using Cardano smart contract based dApps, but I also like using hardware wallets. I pretty much don't ever want any assets that I actually care about to not be on a hardware wallet. Right now, I find myself doing a lot more things with assets that I have to put in a non-hardware wallet just so that I can interact with some Cardano smart contract. And of course, this is just kind of an intermediate phase in the evolution of the Cardano ecosystem. I think we're all super happy to have Cardano smart contracts, all the different things that's enabling. And we're also really happy to have hardware wallets so we don't lose all of our funds somehow. And we just kind of need those two things to overlap. I think this post is an example of that starting to happen. Here we see WingRiders posting so close, but officially we have to wait for the ledger update. And then they say, or kind of as in, or do we? If you're just listening, the image they posted is of someone using a ledger with their cell. And it looks like on the WingRiders mobile app, it says swap request submitted. So I think we're to believe that pretty soon we'll have ledger integration with the WingRiders mobile app. I think this is a really good move forward. I can't wait until I don't have to move any of my assets off my ledger. I can just keep everything on my ledger and still interact with Cardano smart contracts. If you don't have a ledger, there's an affiliate link down below. I highly recommend you get some kind of hardware wallet, whether it's a ledger or something else. You probably want to put your assets, if it's an amount you care about, on some kind of hardware wallet. I hope everybody is starting out a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.